They said even death feared his name. A boy crowned at just 16, yet his enemies whispered of him as if he were a demon in human flesh. Armies trembled, kingdoms prayed, and when the mighty Saladin heard his name, even legends grew silent. This was no ordinary king. This was the child who walked with the shadow of death, whose rise carved terror into history itself. But behind the crown lay a truth so dark, it was buried in silence for centuries. He was born in a time when kingdoms split. Across the land, the soil was darkened with the ashes of war, and the cries of the oppressed echoed from villages forgotten by rulers too busy clashing swords. Into this chaos, a child was delivered, not into peace, not into comfort, but into a world that expected him to be a savior before he even learned to walk. His birth was marked not with celebration, but with omens. The chronicles whispered that storms tore across the night sky, that wolves howled louder than the bells of the churches, and that a dark cloud lingered above the fortress for 3 days. Superstition fed fear, and fear fed prophecy. This boy would either save his people or destroy them. For many, the crown he inherited was not of gold, but of iron and blood. The throne he was destined to sit upon was not empty when he arrived into the world. It had been claimed and reclaimed, soaked in betrayal, ambition, and executions. His ancestors had clawed their way to power not by unity, but by tearing apart those who stood before them. And yet, despite the rivers of blood spilled, the dynasty was fragile. His father, a king more feared than loved, spent his last years surrounded by enemies who smiled in his presence, but sharpened their blades in silence. When death finally claimed him, the realm was left fractured, with nobles eager to devour the kingdom like wolves circling a dying stag. It was into this vacuum that the boy was placed, crowned not out of honor, but out of necessity. 16 years old, trembling in the shadow of men twice his age, he was thrust into a game of survival that cared nothing for innocence. The weight of the crown was heavier than the boy could bear. The first time he wore it, he staggered beneath its weight, not because it was crafted of gold, but because it carried the expectations of thousands. His youth, instead of inspiring pity, drew scorn. The nobles laughed in their halls, whispering that a child had been made their ruler. They compared him to a lamb led before wolves, a puppet who would not survive his first winter. Yet beyond the walls of his court, among the people, his image began to shift. The peasants, who had long suffered under the greed of their lords, began to see in him a different kind of symbol. To them, his inexperience meant purity, a chance that this child might resist the corruption of those who had feasted on their misery for generations. His every appearance, his every word became mythic, wrapped in the desperate hopes of the oppressed. But where the peasants saw hope, his enemies saw weakness. Beyond the borders of his fragile kingdom, more powerful rulers stirred. None was more feared than Saladin, the sultan whose name carried the weight of both admiration and terror. To his followers, Saladin was justice made flesh, the blade that cut through corruption and foreign invasion. But to the boy king's realm, he was a shadow stretching ever closer, a storm that could not be stopped. The very mention of his armies sent nobles into quiet panic, and soldiers whispered that to fight Saladin was to march toward certain death. For a child king barely stepping into manhood, the thought of facing such a figure was less a challenge than a death sentence. And yet, the chronicles began to tell another story. They claimed that even Saladin himself grew cautious when whispers of the boy reached him. They said the young king carried an aura not of innocence but of something darker. Priests described him as marked by fate, perhaps cursed, perhaps chosen. His name spread like wildfire, carried on the tongues of merchants, pilgrims and spies. Some swore he was a savior anointed by God, while others spat that he was a demon cloaked in royal robes. The contradictions only deepened his mystery, and mystery is more powerful than truth. By the time he turned 16, his very existence had become legend, a figure both feared and worshipped. But legends do not protect against betrayal. Within his court, men who bowed before him by day plotted against him by night. Some saw him as a tool to be manipulated, others as a threat to be eliminated. The boy learned quickly that crowns are not secured by loyalty, but by suspicion. He slept in chambers where guards betrayed him, ate meals from kitchens where poison brewed, and spoke to advisors who longed for his downfall. At 16, he had already tasted the bitterness of trust turned to ash. His smile faded into silence, his innocence burned away by the realization that he was utterly alone. To the people, he was a child of prophecy. To his court, he was prey. To his enemies, he was a target, and to history he would soon become something far more terrifying. As his reign began, the air grew heavy with omens. Famines struck the countryside, rivers dried up, and plagues whispered through the villages. Each calamity was blamed on him. The clergy declared that his youth was an affront to divine order, that no boy should wear a crown. The nobles spread rumors that his bloodline was cursed, that his very presence invited death. And the people, torn between faith in him and fear of the signs, clung ever more desperately to his name. The more tragedy struck, the more his legend grew. He was painted in sermons as the boy who carried death on his shoulders, the cursed king, whose shadow brought ruin. Yet at the same time he was worshipped as the only one who could withstand the storm. Such contradictions trapped him in a cage of myths. No matter what he did, he could never escape the image others had forged for him. It was in this crucible of fear, betrayal, and superstition that the boy was forced to grow. 16 years old, but burdened with the weight of centuries of hatred and conflict, he walked a path that no child should ever tread. He was no longer simply a ruler. He was becoming an idea, a weapon of belief, a figure molded not by his own will, but by the fears and hopes of those around him. The tragedy of his story is not only in what he faced, but in how he was stripped of humanity before his life had even begun. He was no longer seen as a boy. He was no longer allowed to be human. He had become myth, and myths are doomed to end in blood. The world outside his fragile court was no gentler than the world within. Across deserts and mountains, empires collided, and every collision spilled blood into the earth. The boy's kingdom was small compared to the giants that surrounded it, but its position made it both valuable and vulnerable. It stood as a bridge between cultures, where the banners of Christendom and the crescent of Islam clashed in endless cycles of invasion and reprisal. To rule here was not to govern, but to survive. Each border carried scars of past wars. Every fortress was a tomb of forgotten soldiers, and every road was lined with stories of caravans robbed, peasants enslaved, and cities reduced to rubble. The boy inherited not a land of peace, but a graveyard of ambitions where the ghosts of the fallen whispered warnings he was too young to understand. Yet whispers mattered more than armies. In taverns, marketplaces, and monasteries, the boy's name traveled faster than riders could gallop. He was painted in extremes. Some called him God's chosen, a child sent to resist the tide of the East, while others claimed he was cursed, a vessel of doom who would destroy his own people. And as the stories spread, they twisted. One traveler spoke of a youth who rode into battle with fire in his eyes, untouched by blades. Another swore the boy's presence turned daylight into gloom, that crows followed him across the fields. Superstition made him larger than life, and with every retelling, fear grew. It was this fear that both protected and endangered him. Armies that hesitated to fight him did so not because of his strength, but because of the terror conjured by rumor. But rumor is a fickle ally. It can make a king a god one day and a demon the next. Saladin's name loomed like a storm on the horizon. His rise was no accident. From his youth, he carved a path through chaos with discipline, strategy, and a vision that drew both devotion and dread. To his people, he was the embodiment of justice, uniting fractured lands beneath a single banner. To his enemies, he was inevitability made flesh. Every fortress that defied him fell, every army that faced him broke, and every king who opposed him was reduced to memory. When word reached him of the boy king, he did not laugh. Instead, he listened. The Sultan understood power better than most, and he knew that sometimes fear was more dangerous than an army. A child cloaked in legends could become a symbol, and symbols are harder to kill than men. Inside the boy's realm, betrayal festered. Nobles longed to carve the kingdom for themselves, and they used his youth as an excuse to defy him. They hoarded wealth while peasants starved, sent secret envoys to foreign courts, and plotted to replace the boy with one of their own. To them, he was nothing more than an obstacle, yet their arrogance blinded them. In underestimating him, they fueled the very legend that protected him. Every attempt to weaken him only gave rise to new stories of survival. Poisoned chalices were refused by instinct, assassination attempts foiled by chance. Servants swore they saw shadows move to shield him, that unseen hands guided his steps. Each escape fed the myth of invincibility, until even his would-be killers began to question whether they fought a boy or something greater. But power built on fear is a fragile throne. As famine deepened, as fields withered and villages emptied, resentment spread. Racism sharpened old divisions. Native peasants despised the foreign lords who taxed them, while those same lords cursed the boy's bloodline as weak, tainted, and unworthy. Every difference, language, faith, color, origin, became a weapon. The boy, barely more than a child, was forced to stand as a wall against centuries of hatred, and though he wore the crown, it weighed heavier with each passing day. By his 17th year, he no longer resembled a boy. The crown had carved lines into his face, his eyes darkened not by age but by burden. The myths around him grew so vast that even he could no longer separate truth from superstition. Was he truly cursed, as the clergy proclaimed? Was he truly chosen, as the peasants swore? Or was he simply a child trapped in the jaws of history, crushed beneath expectations no mortal could bear? It did not matter what he believed. What mattered was what the world believed of him, and the world had decided he was no ordinary king. He was the shadow of death walking in flesh. The kingdom tightened around him like a noose. Each day brought fresh disasters, and each disaster was laid at his feet. When famine struck, the priests declared it a punishment for allowing a child to wear a man's crown. When pestilence spread, the nobles whispered that his cursed blood invited disease. When villages burned at the hands of raiders, they said it was because their boy king lacked the strength to command respect. No victory could silence the murmurs. No act of mercy could erase the rumors. The more he tried to rule with justice, the more he was accused of weakness, and the more he hardened his heart, the more they called him cruel. He could not win, for every step he took deepened the legend that had grown beyond his control. Racism tore through his realm like a second plague. Foreign-born soldiers were blamed for thefts they did not commit. Peasants spat on nobles whose bloodlines came from across the sea. And the court, divided along invisible lines of language and heritage, became a battlefield of its own. Old grudges, inflamed by hunger and superstition, turned neighbors into enemies. The boy was forced to mediate disputes older than himself, arguments rooted not in reason, but in generations of resentment. He sat on a throne that had become a tribunal of hatred, watching as his people devoured one another, and while they tore themselves apart, Saladin's shadow grew larger on the horizon. The nobles grew bolder, meeting in secret, conspiring openly. They saw opportunity in his youth, profit in his downfall. Yet the more they plotted, the more their schemes seemed to fail. One was found dead in his chambers, face twisted in terror, though no wound could be seen. Another vanished on the road, his retinue slaughtered by unknown hands. Some said it was the boy's doing, that he had already learned the art of vengeance. Others swore darker forces moved on his behalf, that demons walked at his side, unseen, but merciless. The line between truth and fear blurred, and in the blur his power grew. It was not armies that kept him on the throne, but the terror that his name conjured. Even those who hated him most hesitated to strike, uncertain if they were fighting a child or something far more dangerous. In the villages, the people's desperation twisted into worship. Mothers traced his name on the foreheads of their children, praying it would shield them from death. Soldiers refused to march unless banners bearing his crest were raised, convinced that his symbol alone would guard them from slaughter. His likeness was carved into wood and stone, not as a king, but as a saint or a spectre. The lines blurred until the boy himself could no longer recognize the reflection the world had forged of him. He had ceased to be flesh and blood. He had become an omen, a story, a curse whispered in the dark. But myths come at a price. The boy found himself isolated, stripped of companionship, burdened by an image too vast for any mortal to sustain. He could not laugh without being called foolish, could not weep without being called weak, could not pray without being accused of blasphemy. His every gesture became prophecy, his every silence became threat. And so he learned to wear the mask. The world demanded, cold, unreadable, haunted. Behind the mask the boy withered. Behind the legend a child was dying. And all the while Saladin advanced. Each city that fell to him carried warnings of what was to come. Each fortress that crumbled tightened the ring around the boy's fragile realm. And yet, even as the storm approached, even as the Sultan's armies drew near, it was not Saladin that the boy feared most. It was those closest to him, the men who smiled as they sharpened their daggers, the priests who raised their hands in blessing while condemning him in secret, the people who prayed for him in the morning and cursed him by night. Betrayal was certain, inevitable, and when it came it would strike not from across the desert but from within his very walls. Thus the stage was set. A child crowned in blood, wrapped in superstition, betrayed by his own, and hunted by an empire that had never known defeat. The boy who should have been forgotten became the boy whom even death feared to claim. His story was no longer his own. It belonged to history, to legend, to fear. And as the world closed in around him, the shadow of what was to come grew longer, darker, more inevitable. The boy king's reign had become a stage upon which shadows danced. His crown gleamed in the candlelight of his court, but beyond the glitter lay ruin. Famine gnawed at the fields, leaving cracked earth where once there had been harvests. Villages that had once sung the hymns of faith now whispered curses into the night, blaming the boy for their suffering. Priests stood in pulpits declaring every drought, every plague, every death as proof that their king was cursed. To his enemies, this was not coincidence. It was opportunity. The nobles sharpened their knives. They met in secret chambers, cloaked in velvet and deceit, plotting to remove the boy, who had somehow survived longer than they imagined. To them, he was a child who had wandered onto a battlefield he could not understand. They had underestimated him once when he wore the crown at 16. They would not underestimate him again. This time they would not wait for famine to weaken him or for Saladin's armies to crush him. They would strike from within. Betrayal would bleed him before the enemy could even march to his gates. But the boy was no longer the child they mocked. He had grown beneath the shadow of suspicion, hardened by poison in his cup and daggers at his back. Each betrayal had taught him, each near death had stripped away his innocence. His face was no longer the face of youth, but of a ruler carved by fear and survival. He no longer trusted his advisors, his courtiers, or even the priests who blessed him. Every smile was a threat, every prayer a curse. And still, the people watched him with eyes that glowed with desperate belief, convinced that this cursed boy was the only barrier between them and oblivion. Rumors swirled faster than arrows in battle. They said that when assassins crept into his chamber at night, shadows rose from the walls and struck them down. They said that when he rode across the countryside, crows circled above him, crying out like prophets of doom. They said he had walked through fire unharmed, that the sword that struck him shattered in the assassin's hands. Whether truth or lie, the stories spread across taverns, markets, and churches, and every story made him more than a boy. They made him a legend too dangerous to kill, yet too frightening to serve. Meanwhile, Saladin's armies gathered strength beyond the horizon. Fortress after fortress fell to his disciplined might. His banners stretched across deserts, his name chanted in victory. To his people, Saladin was a figure of justice, but to the boy king's fragile realm, he was inevitable death. Scouts whispered that the Sultan's army was unlike any the world had seen, united, relentless, touched by faith that made them fearless in the face of death. Even hardened generals, men who had fought decades of wars, paled when his name was spoken. They knew what it meant. The storm was coming. Inside the boy's kingdom, tension boiled. Riots flared in the villages where hunger was most severe. Some rose in rebellion, screaming that the king's blood had cursed the land, while others carved his crest into their homes, believing it would protect them from plague. The realm split in two, half who feared him, half who worshipped him. Both sides were dangerous, for both placed upon him expectations no mortal could survive. The boy himself moved through the court like a shadow, silent, watchful, unreadable. He had learned that a single gesture could spark panic or hope, that his silence spoke louder than words. He began to embrace the image the world painted of him, the cursed king, the child of shadows. It gave him power, even if it stripped away his humanity. For in a world where betrayal lurked in every smile, myth was his only shield. And so the stage was set. A kingdom gnawed by famine, a court rotting with treachery, a people divided by faith and fear, and a storm of steel and fire rising in the east. The boy king stood at the center of it all, 16 years old, draped in a crown that had become both his weapon and his curse. He was no longer just a ruler, he was an omen. And as the shadows gathered, history itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when legend and fate would collide. The kingdom had become a tinderbox, and famine was only the spark. Starved peasants gathered in angry mobs, their cries echoing through crumbling streets. Some carried crucifixes, others torches. Some screamed for mercy, others for blood. The boy's name was shouted in the same breath as salvation and damnation. "He is our shield," cried one side. "He is our curse," howled the other. When hunger gnawed deep enough, when graves filled faster than the earth could cover them, faith twisted into madness. In the cities, riots spread like fire through dry fields. Temples were stormed by desperate hands. Priests were dragged into the streets and accused of hiding food. Markets became battlegrounds. Neighbors turned against neighbors, old grudges resurfacing under the weight of despair. Racism festered in the chaos as minorities were blamed for stealing what little bread remained. Foreigners were hunted, their blood spilled in the name of justice. It was not only hunger that killed, it was hate. Inside the castle walls, the nobles saw opportunity. With the boy's people tearing themselves apart, they believed the throne could be snatched from his hands like a toy. In velvet-draped chambers, they swore oaths of treason, whispering of alliances with Saladin himself. To them, better to kneel to the Sultan than to be ruled by a child whom death itself refused to claim. Their rebellion grew bold, no longer hidden in shadows. They spread pamphlets and rumors, poisoning the boy's image in the eyes of his subjects. He was painted as a tyrant, a devil, a cursed idol of destruction. But the boy king answered not with words. He answered with fear. When nobles rose against him, mysterious accidents befell them. A general plotting treason was found lifeless. In his chamber, his face frozen in terror, as if he had glimpsed something unspeakable in the dark. A bishop who denounced him was struck by lightning during a sermon, a bolt that split the altar in two. To the people, these were omens. To the boy, they were weapons. He had learned that to survive, he must allow myth to do what his sword could not. It was during these days that Saladin's emissaries arrived. They rode into the kingdom draped in silks, carrying letters sealed in gold. Their words dripped with honey, yet concealed blades. They offered peace, but only if the boy surrendered his crown and bent the knee. The court held its breath as the boy king read the scroll. He was 16, surrounded by men twice his age, who whispered that he should accept, that survival was better than annihilation. But the boy raised his head and tore the parchment in two. Silence gripped the hall. Some saw defiance, others saw doom. The emissaries left, their eyes cold, carrying with them the promise that Saladin would answer not with words but with steel. The boy's decisions grew harsher. Mercy became weakness in the eyes of his enemies. Cruelty became proof of his curse. He ordered public punishments for traitors, not to preserve justice but to maintain terror. Gallows creaked day and night, the earth beneath them soaked with blood. To his people, he was no longer just a king. He was a figure caught between man and myth, mercy and monstrosity. His enemies painted him as the devil's child, and with every act of brutality, the line between truth and legend blurred. Yet, behind the mask, he remained what he had always been, a boy, A boy forced to wear a crown that burned upon his head. A boy who had never known peace, only the sound of whispers and the weight of fear. In the solitude of his chambers, he stared at his reflection and no longer recognized the face that looked back. The child was gone, and in his place stood the shadow others had made of him. He was no longer flesh and blood in the eyes of his people. He was an omen. The breaking point had come. His kingdom was not only preparing for Saladin, it was preparing for its own collapse. Hunger had turned neighbor against neighbor. Betrayal rotted his court, and the boy himself had begun to drown in the legend built around his cursed name. Each day he walked the halls of his fortress like a ghost, surrounded by prayers and curses, love and hatred, but never trust. And beyond the walls, Saladin's armies drew closer, their banners rising like a tide against the horizon. The boy's fate was sealed. He could no longer turn back. The road to war had been carved, not by his choice alone, but by a world that demanded he either become a monster or perish as a child. The horizon burned with banners. Saladin's army was no longer rumor, it was a tide of steel and faith, sweeping toward the boy's fragile kingdom. Scouts returned with stories that chilled even hardened generals, an army so vast it seemed endless, their discipline unbroken, their conviction unshakable. To the boy's people, it was not simply an army, it was divine judgment. To the boy himself, it was the shadow he had been walking toward since the day the crown touched his head. Inside his castle, the final collapse began. The nobles who had once plotted in whispers now betrayed him openly. Some defected to Saladin, offering secrets in exchange for safety. Others raised their own banners, declaring themselves rightful rulers. Even within his household, trust dissolved like mist in the morning sun. The boy's closest advisors vanished in the night, fleeing before the storm they believed inevitable. He was 16, standing in halls that had once echoed with loyalty, now filled with the silence of abandonment. But not all had left. Around him gathered a circle of believers, men and women who had chosen to bind their fates to his, whether through loyalty, superstition, or sheer desperation. They whispered that he could not die, that the shadow of death walked with him, that to stand at his side was to stand under divine protection. Their faith was not in the boy, but in the legend he had unwillingly become, and yet it was enough. It gave him an army, broken though it was, to march against the storm. The march began at dawn. The boy rode at the front, his armor blackened, his crown hidden beneath a steel helm. Behind him trailed a force of fractured loyalty. Peasants, wielding farming tools, soldiers hardened by famine, mercenaries paid in promises rather than gold. They did not march as one people but as fragments bound together by desperation. And yet, when the boy rode, they followed. Not because he was their king, but because he had become something more, a myth that defied death itself. Along the road, the world seemed to conspire to feed his legend. Flocks of black birds circled above their march, a living shroud of wings that followed them for miles. Storm clouds gathered but never broke, as though the heavens themselves waited for his command. When villages saw him pass, some knelt and begged for salvation, while others spat curses and prayed for his downfall. The land itself seemed divided, unsure whether to fear or worship the shadow-crowned boy. Yet for all the omens and legends, the boy's heart carried only silence. He did not see himself as invincible. He did not believe the whispers of shadows. That rose to defend him. He felt only the weight of doom pressing closer with each step toward Saladin's armies, but he could not turn back. To retreat was to die. To surrender was to vanish. The only path left was forward, toward the storm, toward the battle that would decide not only his life, but the very truth of the myth that had consumed him. And so the march continued, a slow crawl toward destiny. The boy's shadow stretched, long across the earth, a symbol both of fear and hope. Each day his army thinned, some deserted, others fell to disease, many simply vanished into the night. But those who remained grew fiercer, convinced that survival itself was proof of divine will. With every loss the legend hardened. With every death the survivors whispered that their king had been chosen for something beyond mortal understanding. At last, the boy crested a hill and saw them. Saladin's host stretching across the horizon, like an ocean of steel. Banners of green and gold rippled in the wind, the sound of drums echoing like the heartbeat of the earth itself. In that moment, the boy understood. All his life he had been walking toward this sight, toward this collision of myth and reality. The storm had come, and history itself held its breath. The battlefield was a sea of banners. On one side, Saladin's host stretched beyond sight, rows upon rows of soldiers clad in iron and faith, their chants rising like thunder across the desert wind. On the other, the boy's fractured army stood in silence, broken spears and patched armor gleaming dully beneath the morning sun. They were outnumbered 10-1, outmatched in discipline, yet bound together by the unshakable belief that their king could not die. The boy rode forward, his blackened armor swallowing the light, his crown hidden beneath steel. The silence that followed him was heavier than the roar of any army. His men watched him not as flesh and blood, but as the shadow they believed in, the boy who walked with death. His youth was gone. His innocence had burned away in betrayal and famine. He was no longer a child in their eyes. He was the omen they had waited for. Saladin's drums rolled across the battlefield, a steady, relentless heartbeat. His generals shouted orders, banners dipped, and the tide began to move. The ground trembled beneath the march of thousands, dust rising like a storm cloud. Against such power, the boy's army seemed like an afterthought, a fragment of defiance soon to be erased. But still they stood, still they waited. Then the boy raised his sword. A single gesture, and the world shifted. His army roared, surging forward with a desperation born not of hope, but of fury. Steel clashed with steel, cries split the air. Blood soaked the dust. The boy rode at the front, cutting into the tide like a blade through water. His sword struck with unnatural precision, each blow feeding the legend. Soldiers who faced him swore they saw shadows rise at his side, cutting down enemies with invisible hands. To his men he was invincible. To his enemies he was terror made flesh, but legends could not hold forever. The boy's army faltered under the weight of numbers. For every enemy slain, 10 more surged forward. His knights were torn down, one by one, swallowed by the tide. Mercenaries fled, peasants broke ranks, deserters scattered into the hills. The battlefield became a graveyard, the cries of the dying drowning out the thunder of drums. Still, the boy fought on. Arrows rained from the sky, yet none struck him. Blades swung toward his throat, yet they shattered or missed as if struck aside by unseen hands. His enemies began to whisper even as they struck, "He cannot die. He is not human." Fear rippled even through Saladin's ranks. For a moment, myth seemed to outweigh reality. But reality is merciless. A traitor struck from within, one of his own. An armored knight who had sworn loyalty turned his blade upon the boy. The strike missed his heart, but the betrayal pierced deeper than steel. The boy staggered, the illusion of invincibility breaking. His men faltered, their roars dimming into cries of despair. The tide swallowed them whole. Saladin himself did not need to strike. The battle was won by numbers, by patience, by the breaking of faith. The boy, though bloodied, still stood at the center of the storm, surrounded by corpses and shadows. He did not fall. He would not fall. Even as his army dissolved, even as the ground beneath him was soaked in death, he remained upright, sword in hand, a silhouette against the burning horizon. And in that moment, even his enemies hesitated. They saw not a child, not a king, but a figure carved into legend, a boy who had fought death itself, who had faced an ocean of steel and had not been broken. To strike him down was not victory. It was blasphemy. And so for one heartbeat, the battlefield fell silent. The storm had reached its peak. History itself seemed to pause, caught between myth and reality, waiting to see whether the boy would rise beyond mortality or be swallowed by it at last. The battlefield lay in ruins. Smoke rose in thin black columns, carrying with it the stench of iron and death. The cries of the wounded had faded into silence, broken only by the cawing of crows that circled overhead, waiting for their feast. Where once an army had stood, now only corpses carpeted the ground. Dust, blood, and shadows, the remnants of men who had marched believing they were part of something greater. At the center of it all stood the boy. His sword was broken, his armor torn, his body pierced by wounds that should have killed him. Yet he remained on his feet, swaying like a flame that refused to be extinguished. His enemies dared not strike the final blow. Even Saladin's generals, hardened by countless wars, hesitated when they saw him. For what stood before them was no longer a king nor even a boy. It was a figure carved into legend, a living ghost wrapped in defiance. When at last he collapsed, it was not from the blade of an enemy, but from the weight of exhaustion, betrayal, and inevitability. His body fell to the ground, but his shadow remained. Men swore they saw it linger, stretched across the earth long after his breath was gone. Some said it rose and walked away. Others whispered that death itself refused to claim him, that his spirit marched onward, haunting the lands that had betrayed him. The news spread faster than armies across villages and cities. Peasants whispered of the boy who fought death. To some he was a cursed child whose fall ended their suffering. To others he was a martyr, a savior who had carried the sins of a broken kingdom upon his shoulders. Ballads were sung, stories written, myths born. Each tale twisted the truth, but all agreed on one thing: he had not died like a child. He had stood like a king. Saladin himself ordered that the boy's body be treated with honor. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps fear, or perhaps the recognition that some enemies cannot be erased by conquest. Armies can be destroyed, thrones can be taken, but legends are immortal. And so the boy's story survived, passed down in whispers, in warnings, in prayers. Generations later, when peasants saw crows circling in the sky, they would whisper his name. When famine struck, they would speak of his cursed reign. When injustice rose, they would recall the child who defied an empire at 16. His shadow became part of the land itself, a symbol of both fear and hope, a reminder that even the weakest can stand against the inevitable. And so, the boy who wore a crown too heavy for his head became something greater than any king. He became a question that history could not answer. Was he cursed or chosen? Was he a demon or a savior? Was he a child destroyed by power or a legend who defied death itself? The truth was buried in silence, lost beneath centuries of myth. But the question remains, echoing even now. When death itself fears your name, do you ever truly die?